Good afternoon, members. It is now 1:04, April 7. Uh, With 8 members present, this constitutes a quorum. Please take a look at the agenda. If you want to add anything or remove anything, let me know. All right, if there are none, can I get a motion to adopt today's agenda?
Second.
Motion was adopted, seconded, discussion? All those in favor, say aye. All opposed, say nay. Motion carries. Today's agenda is hereby adopted. Moving on to the next item, public comments. We don't have anyone in the gallery, so moving on to new business. The first item on new business is House Bill 22-06 to amend 4 CMC subsection 1401D to increase revenues by properly taxing tobacco products. All right, members, I received a comment from Rep Tina Sablan, that I guess the AG is preparing their comments on this particular bill as they wanted to update the definition of tobacco as well as incorporate some of the taxing on tobacco with a similar bill, and that bill is being I think they're reaching out to the author of House Bill 22-06 to see if they can I guess merge the bills together since they kind of go together. And so with that, members, if you guys are okay that we table this bill for the next meeting, is that okay with everyone?
No objection.
No objection? All right, so with that, House Bill 22-06 is tabled. Moving on to 22-08, to establish the level of funding for the legislature and provide the legislature with control of the expenditure of funds appropriated for its operations. Now open the floor to discussion. I recognize the Vice Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a good bill that we passed in the last legislature, and it came about to give more independence to the Legislative Bureau. And this bill is similar to there's a bill that we passed on the judiciary's procurement process, which now falls under the jurisdiction of the judiciary instead of the executive branch. So this bill is basically in line or similar to that process that is now under the judiciary's purview. I know I don't have the comments that were, I guess, sent in from other agencies. Mr. Chairman, if those are available, we would need to look at them.
Yes, Vice Chairman, we solicited comments from the Secretary of Finance and the AG's office. We did a follow-up with the AG's office, have not heard back. We did get one comment from Finance, and that is the Secretary of Finance's memo 2021-092. Did everyone get a chance to review that comment?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I did not receive a copy of the comment from Secretary of Finance.
Okay, hard copies were distributed by my staff. Let me check.
If I may continue.
Yes, Vice Chair.
While we're awaiting the hard copy, in the last legislature, we had been allocated funds for our individual offices. So each member, we have to do our own office operations, including hiring staff or obligating some funds for other activities, only to find out that there was a unilateral cut for our budget without at least 30 days or 15 days notice, and that affected a lot of our operations, including the contracts that we entered into. We're fortunate that we did not get sued in our individual capacities for not funding what contracts that we entered into. And this is one of the reasons why this bill was introduced and why the House passed legislature passed it. Thank you, Payu.
Thank you, Vice Chair. The floor is open. I recognize Rep. Staffler.
Thank you, Chairman Minguania, and thank you for explaining the background and history of this bill, Vice Chair Blanco. I was curious, in Section 2, letter B, about the annual appropriation being 6% or not less than $8 million. What was the previous budget from the past prior to it being touched that time you mentioned, Vice Chair?
I do not recall, Madam Chair, what it was, but it was below what is constitutionally allowed or by constitution provided for us.
Thank you. I guess I just wondered where the $8 million number came from.
Council, can you look at the Secretary of Finance's comment, the second page? By the way, members, I just forwarded you an electronic copy if you want to review that as we go along. This is in regards to the conflict with the Constitution, or how it may be in conflict with the Constitution. I recognize Rep. Lavalta.
I would like to ask Mr. Chairman if we can bring in the fiscal analyst for this, just because I have some questions. And I think he would be able to answer it. Would that be, if there are no objections?
We can. Any objections from the members? I call for a short recess while we get the fiscal analyst in and we'll get the legal counsel to get the comment from the secretary.
Thank you.
Director Tenorio, some of the members had questions in regards to the House Bill 22-8, which establishes the level funding for the legislature. I now give the floor to Rep. Labalta.
I was just concerned, Acting Director Tenorio, about the percentage there. And it's in the bill, it requires, the bill proposes to have the legislature control their own finances and print their own checks and everything. And there's also an amount there, 8 million or 6% or not more than 8 million. And one of the questions that was posed earlier was, is that we were trying to figure out what the previous ceiling was to compare it to that amount, because I understand this is a bill that was previously introduced and they're, trying to bring it back again so the House of Representatives can act on it. So I'm wondering if you are familiar with the previous ceiling, and is the 6% feasible for the legislature to function, to operate under?
I don't have the numbers with me now, but prior to the submission of our budget to the governor's office, we ran some numbers based on the constitutional mandate, based on an increase of the consumer price index as it impacts the Legislative Bureau. And I need to go get that document, but this number sounds right.
Okay.
But it's a combination of not only the Legislative Bureau, but also what's supposed to be assigned for the House and the Senate, and also in this case, the Youth Congress as well.
I don't think you need to, if you say it's roughly around the same amount, we'll take your word for it.
Okay, but I will submit that to you when I get a chance.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Director Tenorio? Acting Director Tenorio? Okay, short recess. All right, we're back at House Bill 22-08. Any other discussion? So in case the members did not get to see the history, this was introduced by Rep. Lee Kwan back in the 21st. The only comments that were received were from Secretary of Finance. That's also what we got for this bill. And it was passed and transmitted to the Senate, but it did go out of committee and no further action was taken. So with that, members, motion to adopt this House Bill 22-08. It was moved and seconded. Discussion? Ready? All in favor of adopting House Bill 22-08, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Motion carries. House Bill 22-08 is now adopted in its current form. Moving on to House Bill 22-11 to enact a provision to require all CMI government agencies to prepare and submit a fiscal impact statement and a fiscal revenue statement for related legislations to the legislature when said agencies are affected and required to do so by law. Discussion on the bill. I recognize Vice Chair Blanco.
Thank you, Chairman. I just remembered that I'm the mover of this bill. This bill came about from the support from the Department of Finance, because as we know, many measures that the previous legislatures passed and were enacted into law did not factor in the fiscal impact of those legislations. So many activities are on the books, but there's no activity to enforce what's in law, because there's no funding that goes with it. And so finance, I had an opportunity to sit down with them, and they proposed that, and this is very important, especially on page 2. If you look at section 101, item 1, line 20. If I may just read it out, Mr. Chairman. All government agencies, both autonomous and non-autonomous, shall, and right here, the key sentence is, upon request of a legislative committee, prepare a fiscal impact or a revenue statement impact. So it does not necessarily force or twist the arms of the agencies to provide such information. It is only when it is requested by a certain committee, for example, natural resources or Ways and Means or other committees. I understand the AG did provide its statements on it and its concern about, does anybody have the AG's? This is from last legislature.
Please read that out, Vice.
Okay, the bill, this is from the Attorney General regarding said bill. The bill presents a serious separation of power issue. The research and drafting of bills to be introduced and passed by the legislature is an integral function of the legislative branch, assisted by the LB. Indeed, the Constitution states that, quote, the Bureau shall provide all required services to the legislature in connection with duties and responsibilities during sessions and committee meetings. It shall maintain all records, files, library, and other documents of the legislature. Although executive departments and agencies have in their possession a wealth of public information, the function of assessing the fiscal, economic, and social impact of legislation lies with the legislature, its committees, and the Legislative Bureau. While I understand the concern from the Attorney General's office, let's take into consideration this scenario. Let's say in the budget process, the Attorney General's office has noticed that there's growing cases for, let's say, real estate matters pertaining to the public lands. Now they need to create another division. Right now the divisions, I understand, are criminal and civil. But let's say they propose that they need to add another division for real estate litigation. Who would be best to provide the fiscal impact of creating a new division? Is it the legislature or is it the AG's office? I would think it would be the AG's office, right? Because they would know how many attorneys they would need, how much office space they would need, office rental, maybe vehicles, other office administrative matters. So that is basically the purpose of this bill, just to invite the agencies concerned what their thoughts are on the fiscal impact of this bill that will affect their services, or how much money can be generated from legislation that would empower them to enforce, say, tax collections or revenue generating activities. You, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
All right, thank you, Vice Chair and mover of the bill. Any other members? All right,
Sure.
I recognize Rep. Staffler.
Thank you, Chairman Mangunia, and again, thank you also Vice Chair Blanco for sharing the why behind it. I agree with you, the logic on how that steps should be taken in order for us to get the best information to make our decisions. I think that most offices will also be glad that they will be part of the numbers that they provide, because I'm sure there are things that people who are not in those decision-making shoes will miss if they don't have the whole picture. And so I do agree and support the logic behind it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Staffler. Any other member? All right, I did get a comment from Rep. Sablan. I think in the title, it should say legislation without an S.
Yes.
And also, I guess her concern about why the reporting details are only required for revenue impact statements. I recognize Rep. Staffler.
I guess I keep kind of trying to compare it to something to help me, build that bridge of understanding what it's related to. It makes me think of a citizen-centric report, right? Like something that the office creates in order to provide information to people who want to see it. And so I would think that that's something that they could definitely take on as part of their responsibilities. So I don't see why that would be an issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Staffler. Any other member? Rep. Pro.
Thank you. And so this is, as it's stated here on page 2, upon request, right, of a legislative committee. It's not mandatory, right? It's upon request. I would just like to know what would be the time frame for awaiting this this statement. What would be the timeline? So if it was requested upon request of the legislative committee for this fiscal impact statement to be prepared, do we have a timeline or a guideline as to how long it will take, or an amount of time as to when that report should, because obviously the legislation needs to be completed or voted upon. So how long would these agencies be given for the timeline? Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Rose. I think that would be up to the chairman or chairwoman of the committee in providing a timeline. I know average requests are we give the agencies would be 10 days, but should the agency require additional time, that would be under that would be up to the chairperson of that committee. Author of the bill, is that, did you have a deadline in mind as to how what the turnaround time would be for the fiscal impact statement?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you very much, Chair Brooks. It's a good point. So for committee work, the guide that we usually use is 10 days for a committee, for an agency to provide their comments on certain bills. But of course, you are correct. If such agencies need additional time, I think that request can be provided to the chairman. Thank you.
And thank you, Chairman and Vice Chairman, for that. So with that said, it provides flexibility in that sense. Thank you. I yield.
Any other member? I guess just before we act on this, if we are gonna act on it, council, did you see the comments from the AG for the last legislature? Sorry, members, I know we requested for comments from the AG's office, sent a follow-up, but we did not get any of those comments for any of the bills. So we are going off of what comments were submitted last legislature. And this is just to address the concern that the AG had with the Constitution, how it may be in conflict. Council.
Yes, Chairman, I reviewed briefly the June 25th, 2019 comment on HB 21-34 with respect to this bill. Is there a specific question or?
Well, just his concerns that how it may. This is in regards to the Article 2 concern. Sorry, what was your response?
My response is that I respectfully disagree that Article 2, Section 17 would be, or any provision of the CNMI Constitution would be violated by requiring, upon specific request, agencies to tell us how, from their perspective, legislation would impact their operations, their fiscal well-being. I think that's just part of a due diligence that we ask the stakeholders or people with an interest, entities with an interest in legislation, that they provide the legislature with the information that we would require to see that the legislation that's introduced by a colleague would actually be sound fiscally and economically from that agency's point of view. And I don't understand how we would be performing our due diligence if we didn't make such a request. We would be subject to criticism if we passed legislation affecting the AG's office, if we didn't ask the AG's office for their opinion on how it would affect their operations. The example that the Vice Chairman gave about creating a real estate division, how are they going to pay for that division if their budget isn't increased? So we would need to ask them how much that would cost, and no better agency would be the AG's office to give us that information. And for them to say it's a separation of powers issue, for them to be required to give us information, I don't quite see the soundness of that argument. Thank you.
All right, thank you, council. So long as these are addressed, the members have the time to hear your opinion on it. I now recognize Rep. Staffer.
I just thought of a question that might affect government agencies. And so, do all government agencies have a fiscal analyst on staff?
No.
Is there a place, like sometimes government agencies go to the AG for, legal advice. Is there a place that people, government agencies can go to for fiscal analyst advice?
Well, if you recall, the chairman's bill, HB 2233,
Yeah.
the comment from the OPA says each agency has their own experts. I think we can go off of that.
Thank you for connecting those dots. Okay. I yield. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rep. Staffer. Any other member? I recognize Rep. Rowe.
Sorry, I'm just looking at the language, because it says here on page 2, all government agencies, both autonomous and non-autonomous, shall upon request of a legislative committee prepare and submit a fiscal impact statement to the legislature, right? They shall, but it says all. Would it really be all or just those that would potentially be impacted? I ask that because certain legislation may not impact every single government agency. And so do we have, it just seems a little maybe cumbersome when it has to go out to every single agency and they have to look at every legislation and respond, we're not affected or we're not impacted. I'm just wondering, is there a way that we can address this with just saying perhaps those agencies which would be impacted by such legislation, just so that it's not so cumbersome to every single agency. That's just a concern that I have. Just because, we're trying to be perhaps less bureaucratic in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up, Rep. Probst. I think this is, and that's why there's a second part to that statement where it says upon request by the legislative committee. So whether a committee chairperson needs the fiscal impact or not, that would be on them to make that request, and that the agency shall comply with that request.
Thank you.
Council, did you want to add?
No, just wanted to just reiterate that. Thank you, Chairman.
So clarified. So basically, it would be up to us to ask for those particular agencies then, right? It's not every agency that would always be expected to respond, just for clarification.
I believe so, yes. Mover in the bill, yes. So that would be on bills that would need or require additional financial information. The chairman or chairwoman of that committee may request for them to prepare a.
Just because, thank you. And just because of the way it is worded, if you read it, look, I'm not going to be technical here, but it says all government agencies, okay, all upon request. So it's saying all of them upon our request. It didn't say some of them upon the request. There's a difference, and that's the only thing that I'm trying to point out, is that there may be some confusion with that. So if they put it out, that means, okay, we're requesting, our legislative committee is requesting for a response. This committee will pinpoint or be specific on those particular agencies. Is that what we're intending here? Okay, just wanted to make that clear. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Probst. I recognize Rep. Leila.
Thank you, Chairman. In following up with Rep. Probst, I just want to point out that in the language from number 2 on page 3, section 2, the language is still there, but it doesn't have the upon request. Do you think that would make a difference in that section to maintain the intent of the upon request? Because it says all government agencies shall prepare without that clarifier. Thank you.
Yeah, section 1 is in reference to a fiscal impact statement, whereas section 2 refers to a revenue impact statement. But then further down the line, it says are required, if you look at line 6, when said agencies are affected and are required by the legislature. So it's just worded differently.
Thank you.
Did that address your concern?
Yes, so clear.
Thank you. Any other comments from the members? If none, I now move to act on House Bill 22-11.
Second.
Would anyone like to make the motion to adopt?
Motion to adopt.
Motion was adopted and seconded. Discussion on that motion?
Ready?
Ready? All those in favor of adopting House Bill 22-11, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. House Bill 22-11 is hereby adopted in its current form. All right, moving on to the next item in the agenda. Short recess.
So the LA
All right, members, moving on to House Bill 22-13 to create the Commonwealth Worker Fee Revolving Fund and to designate the Secretary of the Department of Labor as the expenditure authority of said fund and for other purposes. Discussion on the bill.
If I may, Chair.
I recognize the mover of this bill,
Thank you very much.
Vice Chair Blanco.
So this bill, the last legislature adopted in committee and passed on the floor. And it's one of those bills that were affected by the COVID pandemic, and I suspect that's why the Senate never acted on it. But the bill basically copy paste the federal law into local law and creates a special fund for the Commonwealth Worker Fee Revolving Fund. From what I understand, it's being commingled with the general fund. So that's basically the purpose of this bill. And it gives the Department of Labor, as is, I guess, mirror of the U.S. Department of Labor, the authority over these funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Blanco. So your concern is that it's being commingled with the general fund? Did I get that correct?
If you look at page 3, section 2, line 5. There is hereby established a special fund within the Commonwealth Treasury. So that tells me that it was never created.
Okay, yeah, because the finding seems like it's more of a delay. It may cause delays in the administration of the funds. And I don't remember. I think when I read this bill, it seems more like, rather, in addition to creating the special fund, it just basically gives the Secretary of Labor the expenditure authority, and that was done through Section 2, Parts C and D, or D. But the way it's being done currently, I mean, the Secretary of Labor, I mean, every budget year we see the governor vetoing the appropriations to the CW. So she already has the expenditure authority, yes?
That's the current practice, from what I understand. But if we do have this bill enacted into law, then it will be by statute, including creating the revolving fund that strictly separates the CW funds collected from the general funds.
I have a question for the legal counsel.
I recognize the legal counsel.
Counsel, the NMI Workforce Act, is that a federal law?
Yes, it's referenced on line 16 on the screen. It's the Public Law 115-218.
Yeah, all it says is that the governor submits his certification to the U.S. Department of Labor. They approve his expenditure and then they transfer the monies over to the CNMI government. Right now, the governor has the expenditure authority, or the Department of Labor does. So Rep. Ivan's bill just ensures that there's a separate account for those funds. I think the concern that I have is that we, like 2233, I think we should, maybe have oversight of these funds, or at least be part of the process, and where we see how these funds are spent on, and how and which agencies they are funding. Because in the past, I mean, as we've seen it with the NMTI, some of these funds are not being transferred over.
Yeah.
I do have the fund balance report on the Commonwealth Workers Fund. As of January 31st, 2021, they have a fund balance of 2.8 million. And so I saw that the finding, it says that if you look at line 9, however, the legislature recognizes that The above stated federal process and timing of local appropriations may lead to the delays in the administration of the funds in the fulfillment of the approved plan. But each year they carry over a balance of over $1 million since the start of 2012. And so if we continue to give the Secretary of Labor the expenditure of these funds, I guess the question that I have is why aren't they being spent towards the agencies that need it the most? Any other members would like to comment? I recognize Rep. Staffler.
Thank you, Chairman. If I may share with everyone, this is from page 16 of the, I believe it was 2019 Insular Affairs Report. It said specifically that the Commonwealth Worker Fund annual plan calls for allocations to the Northern Marianas Trades Institute and the Northern Marianas College to fund apprenticeships and other training programs. The CNMI Department of Labor has opportunities to leverage such resources in support of these efforts in developing registered apprenticeship programs and other in-demand and emerging careers. In the spirit of workforce development initiatives, the CNMI Department of Labor also has the opportunity to collaborate with NMC and NMTI. This collaboration will enhance career and technical education and training programs to support the advancement of U.S. workers within the CNMI labor force. I thought it was very telling that the Insular Affairs report specifically named the two entities that actually do provide training for skilled workforce, both academic and trades. And I feel compelled to do what you also have been mentioning to make sure that the funds go to the intended institutions that will actually address our workforce needs. I think especially that we are probably going to have to go back to the table in the US to ask for another extension in 2029, just because of how we understand the labor glut is. And if we don't show enough due diligence on our side, I really feel that we are setting ourselves up for a serious problem. And so I feel that if we're going to put anything in this law, that we should make it a little bit more narrow, possibly, to consider making sure that the agencies who are supposed to get it, and that the money isn't sitting somewhere else. Thank you.
If I may ask the mover of the bill, I know at least within the past two appropriations bill, yeah, we've attempted to appropriate some of these funds, but do you know why those have been vetoed, these past two?
So from what I recall, our legal counsel, Mr. Cool, even though he provided advice that the contract workers' fees are sources outside the local sources, so therefore not subject to legislative appropriation. We still went ahead and appropriated the funds to NMTI, PSS, NMC, and other entities. Those were always vetoed at the executive branch because they feel that it's their prerogative. It's not the legislature's. And if I may allude to Madam Chair Staffler's concern, yes, absolutely. What OIA provided, that's their guidance. What we don't have here locally is who is specifically supposed to be in charge of these funds. Is it the governor's office or is it the Department of Labor? And I think this bill specifically states that it's the Department of Labor, and the funds should not commingle with the general fund, but it should be its own established fund. So that's the basic, simple purpose of this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice. Any other member? Comment? I recognize Rep. Selena.
In line with the Vice Chair Blanco's comments, this bill proposes to identify a specific office, if you would, to be the sole expenditure authority rather than giving it to the governor and commingling it with other funds. First of all, the NMI Workforce Act gives the sole authority to us, is very specific that it is to fund vocational education, apprenticeships, and other training programs for United States workers, and that apparently is not being fulfilled by the governor, if I understand correctly the comments here. And I agree that, you know, we should take that authority away, if possible, from the governor, because apparently it's not being used for what it was intended, you know, for. But I have a question. If we are to create a separate account, is that in excess of what is normally appropriated through the budget process? Is that my understanding of this? And that anybody, legal counsel or?
It's my understanding that, you know, the legislature, we've been trying to appropriate the money, but the argument is that since this is not from the general revenue, this is not from the general fund, it's money from this particular public law, that we don't have the authority to do so. So to answer your question, it would be a separate fund, separate and apart from the general fund. So I think that's what John Cole was alluding to when he said we don't want to appropriate it because it's not an appropriatable identified source. But we're appropriating money in this fiscal bill, so let's appropriate this money too, so that, you know, it's all kind of one cohesive document that appropriates internal CNMI revenue plus outside revenue as well. And I don't know, I tend to think that because the governor is obligated by federal law to provide a spending plan, then these funds are not exactly like, you know, they're not unrestricted funds. They are restricted to that spending plan. So, and the bill here says that the Secretary of Labor has to spend those funds consistent with the spending plan. So it's, if the governor says to the Department of Labor, United States Department of Labor, I'm spending it on ABC, then Secretary Beneventi has to spend it on ABC. That's how I read it.
Yeah. Can we include language here to specify, alluding to the council's comments, specify what these funds can and cannot be appropriated for?
Yeah.
Sole purpose.
But it's not in,
Vocational education, apprenticeships, or other training programs. I guess my concern is other training programs.
Thank you.
I recognize Rep. Rizama.
Yeah, I fully understand what the chairman or vice chairman Longo is trying to do, is to separate the funds. Maybe perhaps identify the amount of what's in that funds and appropriate to the designated agency, authorized agency. And that will give us or allow us to have more transparency, because putting them in a general fund together with the funds from the workforce never come up with the numbers. I don't know if I've ever seen one like that. They're given as a general fund. So I agree with that. And as far as the what agencies, they already specified on a US law. Isn't that, council? It's already in a US public law. That's.
Yeah, in my opinion, the whole thing is basically D. It's like to allow the Secretary of Labor, CNMI, to have access to these funds without fiscal year limitations, and so there's no lapsing. But she already has her hands tied by the law and by the federal law. If the governor says, you know, Department of Labor's, U.S. Department of Labor, I'm spending it on A, B, and C, I don't think she's permitted to go outside A, B, and C. I think the real gist of this legislation is that she's allowed to spend the money without fiscal year limitations, without any lapsing.
Thank you, Council. I recognize Rep. Pro.
Thank you, Chairman. And I just wanted to echo the sentiments of Representative Staffler, when it comes to other agencies. When the governor testified before the United States Congress on labor issues in the Commonwealth, he specifically mentioned NMTI. I think we all saw that. And it was, wow, NMTI. We have NMTI that is training our workforce. Yet for 2 years, they didn't receive a dime since 2019 when we had Mr. Rick Kautz, one of the trustees, who stated, when I asked that question, and the chairman of NMTI didn't even have the answer, but yet a member, the trustee who has been there for many years, Mr. Kautz did. And I asked that specific question. When was the last time NMTI received funding? 2019. I have no problems with this bill and the intent, and it's very clear. But the concern has been and should continue to be where this funding is going. Because you know what? It hasn't been going to NMTI for whatever reasons. And we've heard from NMTI their frustrations as to never receiving this money. I am concerned about other agencies intended for NMTI and NMC, or for these other training agencies that are coming up. So where is this money really going to go to? We know that a big chunk of it has been going to Latte Academy. And is there going to be another one that is created where I'm going to create my own vocational program then, and MMTI doesn't have to get that money anymore. So that, I think, is the concern. It's about trust. Where are these funds going to? And ensuring, that's why these questions have been brought up, like as Representative Staffler had brought up her concerns. And again, I agree with it. I have no issues with the bill, but I do have concerns as to where this money will end up going to. If it's going to be, more dry days for NMTI, then how can NMTI really be functional without proper funding? This is the funding that would give NMTI, but how do we know it's going to go to NMTI? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Rep. Probst. I recognize Rep. Staffler and then Rep. Gabal.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Rep. Probst. I wondered if we can look at language, right? So in Section 2 enactment Part C, line 14 through 16, this is a specific area that we could narrow if possible. But I wondered first, it says, funds deposited into the account shall be used for the sole and executive purpose of funding vocational education, apprenticeships, or other training programs for United States workers as identified in the approved governor's plan under the Northern Marianas Workforce Act in 2018. This part, where do we find the governor's plan? Is that something that we get prior to, is that something we even get a part of? Who approves the plan? The U.S. government, right? And so, do we have to put that language there, or can we put something else? Just asking, respectfully.
Yeah, I recognize the Vice Chair.
Oh, so yeah, the particular section actually is derived from the federal law that's cited over there. It says use of funds. Amounts collected pursuant to Clause I shall be deposited into the Treasury of the Commonwealth Government for the sole and exclusive purpose of funding vocational education, apprenticeships, or other training programs for United States workers. That's specifically from the U.S. Public Law 115-218. But pertaining to the governor's plan, I understand he has to provide that plan before funds are transferred to the CNMI Treasury and commingled with the general fund.
And to add on, I think this is like an ARPA situation, yeah, where the governor submits the plan to the U.S. Treasury, but in this case, U.S. Department of Labor, and they approve the plan. So I mean, if you want oversight on this CW funds, then we can apply the same concept to this in the sense that plan will be approved through a joint resolution, but I'll leave that up to you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments, Rep. Saffer?
Nothing.
All right, I now hand over the floor to Rep. Bavalta.
I have a concern. Once we enact this bill, if we do, and I will refer this question to the council. Once we pass this bill, it becomes local funds, I think, because we've put our hands in it and designated it strictly for the expenditure authority to be the Secretary of the Department of Labor. So how, if that is my understanding is correct of these funds, what we're trying to do with this bill, how does, given the pattern of previous legislatures granting the governor 100% reprogramming authority, how does that come into play if we designate this to the Secretary of the Labor and then, the legislature again, for unknown reasons to me, abdicate their responsibility to, by not giving the governor unlimited reprogramming authority, this bill won't matter if the legislature continues to give him 100% reprogramming. But my question is, does this become local funds, general funds, once we put our hands on it and say it should go here? Let's, council, if you may.
So I'm just referring to the line 7 and 8 where it says the fund shall be accounted for separately from the general fund. So this is where we, again, and I think this is a legitimate earmark, because when you look at the certified question with respect to PSS, what the Supreme Court said is, if you have, all revenue divided into general revenue on one hand and special revenue on the other hand, you can't just label it general or special. It has to be legitimately special or legitimately general. And how do we tell that's the case? Does the funding source legitimately tie to the expenditure? And in this particular case, the funding source is a federal law designed to help U.S. citizens find work. And we're using those funds to legitimately train CNMI residents who are looking to find work and get trained to be, professionals and tradesmen. So I think that this would be deemed special under any kind of legal analysis, and it wouldn't be general revenue. And, and it's already expressly stated that this fund shall be separate from the general fund. So this express language, coupled with the, I believe, reasonable interpretation of the certified question that says this is special revenue, will, in my view, ensure that it's not to be, treated as general revenue. But I don't know what other lawyers will do.
One last question, please. How much exactly are we collecting from CW fees annually? Does anybody know?
Yeah, so for fiscal year 2021, we're expected to receive 1,023,000. Fiscal year 2020, it was around 1.7. 2019 was 628,000. And then 2018 was 2.2. So it varies. And that's dependent upon the number of slots that we're getting. So as I stated earlier, the remaining, the balance that we have as of January 31st this year was at 2.8 mil. Do you have anything else to add before I hand over the floor? Thank you. I recognize Rep. Sheila Bavalta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Vice Chairman Blanco, for introducing this bill. I completely support having a separate account for the CW funds. And so since these fees are being collected at the federal level, then transferred over, to us here at the local level, right now it's being commingled with the general fund. We definitely need to separate that. I support that. I am very concerned that there is a balance, like you just mentioned, and that there's no reporting requirement. So, Mr. Chairman, if you know if there are any reporting of these funds currently, like how was that provided to you? Was that from the Department of Finance or the Department of Labor?
It was from the Department of Finance, and so it does show how much was given to these different agencies. It does not show the details of those amounts that were allotted in terms of when it was allotted. That is probably in a separate report. I just received this report today, and so as of from fiscal year 2020, it looks like they gave NMC $1 million, NMTI $1 million, Lafayette Academy 50,000, and then 200,000 was for the administration of these funds. So I think this is where Leila might have to confirm with NMTI, and then we'll follow up with Department of Labor, because it does show $1 million to NMTI for fiscal year 2020.
And that is exactly my concern, because NMTI reported that they have not received CW funding in the last 2 years, colleagues. And so how are we going to ensure that reporting is accurate and that it's timely, and that, you know, if we're receiving these funds from the federal government, that it's being allocated to these educational institutions for preparing our U.S. workers. If there's a way we can, if the mover is open to an amendment to include language to require reporting of these funds, otherwise I don't see how it would be reported. Would it be required from the Department of Labor to report it during the budgeting process under the federal funds received, People Council?
Yes, I believe so. I believe that prior to receiving the money, the governor submits a plan. The Secretary of Labor, the United States Secretary of Labor, approves the plan, gives the money.
Right.
And I believe at the end, within so many days, the governor has to report on the usage of the funds and whether or not he complied with the plan. And then they analyze whether or not he's legitimately claiming success or not. Whether he truly used it for the purposes he set forth in the plan.
And that's between our governor and the U.S. Department.
It's all federal, yes.
Right. There's no local oversight.
Yeah. If I can have the author of the bill say something.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, Madam Chair. That's a good point that you brought up. So, number one, I think this bill specifically now says, okay, CNMI Department of Labor, you are in charge of everything CW. Right now, I don't think there's any statutes stating such. As to the reporting, according to Public Law 115-218, there's a section that says not later than 120 days before the first day of fiscal year 2020, and annually thereafter, the Governor of the Commonwealth Government shall submit to the Secretary of Labor plan for expenditure amounts, the effectiveness of such expenditures, to report on changes in employment of United States workers attributable to the expenditures, and so on and so forth. So there is a reporting requirement of 120 days when the funds were transferred starting in 2020. That's about what, 10 months? I'm not aware there's any report. 10 months after, no later than 120 days before the first day of fiscal year 2020.
Yeah, so he should have submitted, the governor should have submitted the report prior to October 1st. And that's the 1.7, or the 1,023 that came in this fiscal year. You still have the floor, Rep. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Are you saying that's the plan? Do you have a copy of the
Oh,
governor's?
no, we
plan?
don't, it goes directly to the Department of.
Right, so we haven't seen it.
No.
And
Um,
we also know that there's been a balance for a couple of years in this, with the CW funds that has not been transferred over to NMC or NMCI, right? And so now you have said earlier that we've had a 1 million balance for the past 2 years.
over 1 million, close to even over 2 million for most of the years.
So why are we holding on to money when we know these institutions need money and are always looking for money? So that is the point that I just want to bring up, is that, although there are requirements for the spending plan to be submitted to the federal government to be approved, there really is no way we at the local level can know whether these funds are actually being remitted to these agencies. And so with this bill, we will separate the funds. Department of Labor will report it during the budget, in their annual budget, because it will be considered federal funding received by the department. And then the fiscal year limitation. So this is the language that allows for the funds to carry over.
Yes.
Why?
Yeah, why?
Why can't we zero it out? Zero it out and give it to NMC and NMCI? Is there a reason, Mr. Chairman or Rep. Blanco, is there a reason why we keep a balance in this,
I'm trying to read the federal law and I don't see any fiscal year restriction. I may be wrong.
Legal counsel, are you aware of any fiscal year limitations and maybe some reasons why we need to keep that language? Because I'm thinking if these institutions are always in dire need of funding, we should consistently zero out the money that we receive from the federal government and just transfer it over. So.
I honestly, I don't know, I'd have to look at it, but, again, I want to just reiterate, the governor has a spending plan that's approved by the US Department of Labor. And if he doesn't comply with that plan, then there's going to be a mechanism where I think sooner or later, the governor's actions or inactions will be deemed to be in violation of the law. And then at that point, the funding source may dry up. I don't know what kind of ramifications there will be, but.
Is that stated in the law that you are reviewing right now? Is there any penalties? Should we not comply with the approved spending plan?
May I, Chair? Council, may I?
Sure.
I'll just read off from the federal law. There's a section that says payment restriction. Payments may not be made in a fiscal year from amounts deposited under subparagraph A, III, which is the current deposits, before the Secretary of Labor has approved the expenditure plan submitted under subparagraph BI for that fiscal year. So, although unrelated to this bill, the question is it we have not spent that money because the U.S. Secretary of Labor has not approved the spending plan? That one I don't know. I'm not sure, but there is a provision in the federal law that says payments cannot be made if there's no approved plan. That could be the reason why the 2.8 is still sleeping.
They have been made, that's why the money's sitting in their account.
Right, so even though the money is in our account,
Yeah.
it cannot be made, any payments cannot be made from it without the approval of the U.S. Secretary.
That's not how I read it. I'm reading it as, I'm looking at you. It's on the TV.
Oh, yeah, okay, so how are you reading it, Council?
This is the provision for the money to enter the CNMI, Chairman, Vice Chair, that the payment by the Secretary of Labor, U.S. Secretary of Labor, cannot come into the CNMI until the Secretary of Labor from the U.S. has approved the governor's expenditure plan. So the mere fact that the money is sitting in the account means that the governor submitted a plan and the Secretary of Labor of the United States approved it. Hence, the money is sitting in the account.
Okay, so the way I'm reading it is that the US Labor has transferred the money to a CNMI account,
Right.
but that money cannot be used, expended without the US Labor's approval.
Already was approved.
I don't read that. That's not how I read it, sir.
It seems like it was approved, that's why they transferred the money over.
Right.
Okay, I'm reading it differently, but
Yeah. So the payment that they're talking about right there is the payment to the CNMI. And once we've already confirmed that it's already in the CNMI's coffers, right? So the way I'm reading it is that the governor's plan was approved, the Secretary of Labor transferred the money into the CNMI's coffers, and now we're hearing about it being unexpended. And so I don't think that there's a problem that the federal government hasn't yet approved of the governor's spending plan, because if they didn't approve of the spending plan, as I read the law, we would never see the money. There wouldn't be any money in the account sitting in there. That's how I read the payment, the word payment.
okay, what's AIII? I think we, just for clarification.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, you may need to go up.
Use of funds,
Yes.
amounts collected pursuant to clause 1 or I shall be deposited into the treasury of the Commonwealth government for the sole and exclusive purpose of funding vocational education, apprenticeships, or other training programs for United States workers. So that's the restriction on the usage of the funds.
So you're saying that the earlier provision payment, use of restrictions on payments,
Yeah,
you're saying the US Labor will not transmit the funds without approving the governor's plan. Is that your reading?
yes, that's my reading, yes.
So clarified?
You still have the floor, Rep. Cavallo.
Thank you, Chairman. Okay, so far, the bill, again, separates the funds. It identifies the Secretary of our CNMI, Department of Labor, as the expenditure authority. The funds must be spent for the sole and exclusive purpose of funding vocational education, apprenticeships, or other training programs. It cannot be appropriated. It is not considered part of the general fund. But again, Mr. Chairman and Rep. Blanco, the author, I am concerned about, well, my reporting concern has been addressed during the budgeting process, because then the Department of Labor will and must report this as federal funds received. And so my other concern about the fiscal year limitations is what I'd like to propose an amendment for, to just remove that language. And so that we can ensure that when we receive these funds every year, it's all spent. Nothing is left. We don't need to hold on to it. Give it to NMC, give it to NMTI. Let us really invest in our programs. Let us invest in our workers, and really let's show the federal government that we're using the money and that we need it to prepare our local workforce and build capacity. So I'd like to offer an amendment to remove line on page 3, line 20, without fiscal year limitations. And if legal counsel can clarify if we also need to amend line 8, where it says and is non-lapsing.
All right, yeah, short recess. Sheila Baraka proposed an amendment, so I'll hand over the floor to her.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I'd like to withdraw my proposed amendment, and I yield.
Thank you, Rep. Abalta. I now recognize the.
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman. Before I make my motion, can I give the floor to the legal counsel? You wanted to clarify something from the U.S. federal law?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chairman. I stand corrected on the reading. I think that your interpretation actually has merit. I think that upon further review, there may be some merit to your suggestion that there may be a possibility that the money will enter the CNMI upon approval of the governor's broad plan, and then there are federal requirements that the Secretary of Labor approve a specific expenditure plan, which may be delayed for whatever reason, and that's why it's plausible that your suggestion is correct, that maybe the fact that the money is not spent and it's sitting in our coffers because we haven't gotten an expenditure plan approval, despite the fact that the money has already been remitted to the Commonwealth. So I take back what I said about your reading being incorrect. I think your reading is fair and plausible, and I stand corrected. Thank you.
Thank you, Council. Vice Chair, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Council. So, because in respect to the members of the committee, since there's more questions on the bill, if there's no objection, if we table it and perhaps invite the Secretary of Labor in the next scheduled Business meeting. I move.
Second.
All right, a motion was made by the mover of the bill to table House Bill 22-13 and seconded by Reps Staffler and Gazama. All those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Motion carried. House Bill 22-13 is tabled. Moving on to House Bill 22-16 to temporarily suspend the provisions of 4 CMC Section 2159 for the 2021 fiscal year. Discussion on the bill. All right, members, so I got a comment from Rep. Tina Sablan. She mentioned that because of the American Rescue Plan funds, which a good chunk will be going to MVA, that we keep it as is, and that we continue to fund the municipalities. We did receive comments from Secretary of Finance, Tinian Mayor's Office, Rhoda Mayor's Office, and MVA. With the exception of the Mayor Tinian, the other agencies were in support of the bill, but that was prior to the American Rescue Plan Act. And so I'll leave that up to the members to decide, should we further act on this, or how do you want to proceed with the bill?
May, Chairman, may I
Recognize.
May I direct it to Council in light of Madam Chair Sablan's concern? If we do pass this bill into law and the recovery money is here, would that restrict the benefits to the municipalities? Would this have an inadvertent effect or unintended consequence? I'm sorry, am I making myself clear?
Yeah, I think so. Vice Chair, the language states that like 2159 states that the funds are basically 2% goes to Rhoda, Tinian, and Saipan. 2% of the funds per fiscal year from the MVA trust fund. So assuming the MVA trust fund is well funded, that 2% could be, 50,000, 200,000, whatever. But if the trust fund is not adequately funded, and that trust fund is basically, it's a product of, I believe it's 1803, the hotel occupancy tax is what is the source of the trust fund. Assuming that tourism is down and our numbers are down, the revenues not being, deposited into the trust fund, 2% of nothing's nothing. So, I think long story short, it's not really going to be affecting this particular trust fund. If the American Rescue Plan is somehow depositing money into the trust fund, I'm not sure how that would be possible. It's conceivable, but I don't see how. But I don't see I haven't seen the plan for the funds, so I don't know if they're going to deposit any in the trust fund. So it's possible that if they do put money in the trust fund from a source other than the hotel occupancy tax, i.e. the American Rescue Plan, it's possible that this could result in a loss to the municipalities, but it all depends on what's going into the trust fund. I haven't had a chance to review the plan for the money.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Council. So, Chairman, was there any communication from MDA regarding this? The latest communication, I mean, regarding this measure?
Is it prior to ARPA or after ARPA, or just in any comment?
Yeah, will it be comment now post ARPA?
Yeah. We did receive comments from the managing director dated March 26th. I guess I'll read the main paragraph. Needless to say, the MBA does not have sufficient funding to provide remittances or remittance to the municipalities in compliance with 4 CMC section 2159. In addition, delays in fiscal year 2019 and 2020 HOT remittances from Department of Finance have also created delays in payments to the municipalities. However, MBA has met with Department of Finance Secretary and has committed to remitting 2019 and 2020 HOT collections. And MBA should be able to remit payments to the municipalities once these HOT payments are made. So it does not forgive past payments owed. This is just for the current fiscal year. Furthermore, MVA's earmarks have been suspended for fiscal year 2020. Therefore, the MVA will not be receiving any fiscal year 2020 HOT collections.
So basically, there's nothing to transfer if there's no money.
Right.
And by enacting this into law, and let's assume that MDA, of course, was affected by the COVID pandemic, and the ARPA's purpose is to cover for loss of, revenue losses. And one of these is our tourism. And if the ARPA, I really think the intent is to cover these funds that were affected, right, by the tourism. We'll be able to cover how many percentage that goes to the municipalities. But with this law, would that money still go to the municipalities, Council?
If you're assuming that the ARPA funds go into the trust fund, then we'll be at 2%, right? And then so 2% of something is something, but we'll be taking out a guaranteed 300,000 each. So,
but sorry if I may. So currently, with the suspension of the HOT collections, even with that, I mean, there's no 300,000 to remit. Yeah.
That's right. But Vice Chair's hypothetical is assuming the HOT is supplemented by the ARPA, then there actually is money in there.
But it's just, the way I'm looking at it is the HOT, any ARPA funds that will go into the trust fund or the MVA trust would only be to cover the money that was, I guess, borrowed, if you would call it, or lost in the prior fiscal years. But for, let's say, fiscal year 2021, because it was suspended, there's nothing to cover because that, it was suspended, right? That makes sense. So how would they transfer money over to the trust for fiscal year 2020 when there wasn't any law that was reserving any funds for this fiscal year?
Chairman, it all depends on how it's interpreted. If they're gonna consider it arrears and retroactively pay in, then the municipalities will be getting 2% of that lump sum payment. I'm sure they're gonna appreciate that. It all depends on how it's interpreted. It does say per fiscal year, so you can argue it shouldn't be considered arrears. If it was never there, then it was never there. All depends on how it's being interpreted.
Vice, if you still want to add on?
Yes. So on page 2, section 3, sunset provision, we are in April. And if we do suspend the funding to the municipalities from the trust fund, it will take effect only on this fiscal year. But this fiscal year also includes the ARPA. So if we suspend these funds and the ARPA, let's say next month, funds it, does that mean that the municipalities won't get the money?
Can you restate the question one more time? I'm trying to read the sunset provision and hear the question at the same time.
Okay, so sunset provision on September 30th, 2021, the suspension shall end, basically.
Right.
The ARPA has passed. We are in month of April. What happens if we suspend the fundings from the FDA trust to the municipalities, what this bill intends to do, just for this fiscal year? But then the ARPA comes in and replenishes the funds that were lost to the FDA trust fund. Does that mean that therefore, because of this bill, they won't get funding that we're suspending?
I think, yes, they'll only be getting the 2%, which, it says whichever is greater, so they would get the 2% if the 2% was greater, or they would miss out on the 300,000 if the 300,000 was greater.
So your statement was correct.
Yeah.
So this is a tough spot.
Wait, just clarification. So right now each municipality is guaranteed 300. Should hot money be transferred over? Whether, how do I say it?
Yeah, because it says whichever is greater, right? So if it's nothing or 300,000, 300,000 is greater than nothing.
So let's say in a good year, pre-COVID, if only 700,000 was transferred into this trust fund, how do they still, does it become a liability to MVA to fund the remaining 200,000? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it depends on how it's interpreted, but the language does say per fiscal year. So, I think they need to make the calculation per fiscal year, and if nothing was in the trust fund, then there's nothing 2% of nothing per fiscal year. And so I don't think there's necessarily an aggregation. There's no liability that.
Absent this bill, the way it's currently written, where there's either 2% or 300,
Right.
But not less than 300.
Yeah, not less than 300. So yeah.
So there's a shortfall in hot. How do they?
So according to this bill, it's 2% or 300,000, whichever is greater should go to each municipality. So yeah, you're correct. There's going to be a liability in the amount of $300,000 per municipality.
If there's a short in hot.
Yeah.
Collection.
Yes.
I recognize Rep. Sheila.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for clarification, so this bill looks to suspend 4 CMC section 2159. And if we just look further into where the money is coming from to MVA for this trust fund, 20% of the taxes to this trust fund is from the, it's not all from HUT, it's not all from the hotel occupancy tax. So 20% is coming from the soft drink beverage container tax and the alcoholic beverage container tax. So 20% of the beverage container tax and then 80% from HUT. So it's not necessarily a zero balance account, correct?
Yeah.
Because there, I mean, there's definitely soft drinks and alcohol being sold. But,
Well, I think that the argument of that it's zero is because he suspended that earmark that sets aside 20 and the 80%. So nothing gets reserved into this account for this fiscal year.
right, for, in this bill.
No, right now. This current fiscal year, nothing was reserved because we suspended that earmark. We suspended the 20% and the 80%.
1803.
So
Clarified.
right now, there's zero money going into that trust account. So there's nothing to appropriate, but I think that,
The concern is the ARPA.
yeah, that if that gets deposited into the trust account, then we can continue to provide the funding to the municipalities.
Municipalities. Did we get any comments from the mayor's offices on
One
San
mayor.
Antonio and Aurora?
Mayor Rhoda and Mayor Tinian.
Oh, really?
The mayor of Rhoda, I guess, supports the bill, understanding the financial challenges that we are facing, but with the ARPA, that could resolve the issues. The mayor of Tinian, however, the municipality of Tinian relies heavily on these funds to fund beautification projects as well as other projects in Tinian. So he opposes the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is that on the server? Is that accessible on the server, the mayor of Tinian's comment?
I will forward you copies of those.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other member comment on, or how would you like to proceed with House Bill 2260? I recognize Rep. Camacho.
Okay, so, now, the biggest concern here is ARPA, right? We don't know if it's gonna be put into that account. Now, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, why don't we change the language? Maybe when that does happen, it goes back to the original act, but continue on with this bill.
That's gonna happen in the sunset clause anyway.
Oh, sorry.
Can you just repeat your question again?
So our concern right now is whether money from ARPA would be deposited into the trust funds. Now, the sunset provision otherwise says that
It will expire.
yeah, it would expire and revert back, right?
Yes.
So if ARPA doesn't go through, it would be a good bill, right? And if ARPA does go in, then that one will have an issue, right? Okay,
Yes.
so couldn't we change the language on this? And otherwise, if ARPA does go in, then that supersedes it. Legal? Thank you.
Recognize the vice.
I think that might be the saving clause.
Yeah.
Saving clause that says, to push, you know how the council, how some languages say, depending on the availability of funding?
Yeah. Yeah, we could language that way. I just want to point out that, you know, let's assume $1 million goes into the MVA trust fund from ARPA. $1 million is not nothing. 2% is $20,000. So the 300,000 here is substantially more than they probably would get, you know, unless we're going to put in more than $1 million. I don't know how much MVA is going to get into the trust fund from ARPA, if any. But even if they get $1 million, it's still going to be 20 grand. So this is going to hurt the municipalities no matter what.
So if they don't get the amount needed to otherwise get to that 300,000, then this bill stays.
I think the assumption with ARPA is that the municipalities are going to get their money from ARPA, not from the trust fund, you know, so the primary funding source to bail us out will not be the MVA trust fund. It's just, you know, the numbers don't jive, you know. How do you get to $300,000? You need, I don't know about the math, but roughly $60 million. I don't know. You know, it's going to be a large fund. If 1 million is 20,000, how many times is 20,000 going to 300,000? 15 times. We need $15 million.
Then why should ARPA be a part of all this then? We should just not worry about it.
Yeah, I don't think we need to worry about it.
Let this take place and let it go through.
Yeah. Again, the purpose of this is not to hamper MVA's functions. So that's still the main gist of the bill, is to keep MVA from having to bear this loss.
But if it becomes an obligation, they can just request ARPA funds to cover the liability. It's another way to look at it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, members, so there are two ways we can go about this. We can, so if we adopt it, we're suspending the 300,000 for each municipality, and they'll just get 2% of whatever hot money comes in. And, you know, and that's 2% of any ARPA funds that gets deposited into that account, if there's anything that gets transferred over. The other one is if we leave it as it is, it becomes a liability for MVA to pay out the 900,000 for the municipality. And these could be requested from the administration to use the ARPA funds to cover that. I mean, it does fall within the realm of tourism, and so I leave that up to the members. Do you wanna?
Move for a second.
Huh?
Move for a second.
We'll leave it as is. We'll table this bill, or can I get? I recognize Rep. Bagalta.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I did not, hear if we received any comments from MVA
Yes.
and
Oh,
how
I
they
just
have been
read that.
handling this, how they've been handling this, you know, this requirement for the past couple of years. Have they just always?
They owe the municipalities
They owe.
2019 and 2020. So that's the liability that I'm talking about for 2021. When ARPA comes in, they'll have to pay for 2019, 2020, and then 2021. So we're looking at 2.7 million in hot money that will be owed to the three municipalities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other comments, or does anyone want to make a motion to adopt or table House Bill 2216? I recognize Rep. Selena.
I will make a motion to table this.
All right, a motion was made to table House Bill 22-16. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Seconded by Rep. Vicente Camacho. The motion has been placed and seconded. Discussion on the motion?
Ready.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. All right, the House Bill 22-16 is hereby tabled. All right, members, that takes care of new business. So with that, I ask that the legislative assistant prepare the standing committee report, and that we'll get that out to the members once it's done and get that filed for the next session. Moving on to miscellaneous. Members?
Mr. Chairman,
Recognize.
well, if and when you can, will we be able to get copies of the budget? Fiscal year if it was ever submitted? And was there any communication that we need to amend the current budget? Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So in regards to the budget, it was submitted to both houses on April 1st. I believe it was submitted to what was the previous mail server, the leg.gov.mp, but and so the clerk was able to get them to send it over to the correct email. And so that is on the server right now. If you go to the 22nd House of Representatives or Legislature, there's a folder there that says Governor's Budget Submission, and then there's 4 versions. The hard copies are being prepared for by Perry. There's 4 versions of it, 4 volumes, and so there are over 1,000 pages, and so Perry is preparing those for you, and we'll get that distributed to you guys as soon as it's done. And so I ask that you please take a moment to review. If you look at, normally in the past we've been getting 3 volumes. The 4th volume is the governor's proposal combining the general fund with his plan for the ARPA. So take a moment to review that. I'm working with Dave there. He has prepared a summary of the volume 1, which is the gist of all the branches. And so I'll get that out to you. As far as budget hearings, I am working on a calendar to have all the agencies scheduled, and I'll share that with you for final approval before we send that out to the public, so that these agencies can prepare. In regards to any amendment to the current budget, Vice Chair, we did not get any requests other than I understand Medicaid is needing additional FTEs. So I believe Rep. Staffler has a House Joint Resolution under the current budget appropriations bill. In order to increase FTEs, we need to do it through a House Joint Resolution. So she has that getting ready to pre-file for the next session, as well as additional fundings to Medicaid to cover the 10% cost share for those FTEs. And they're also requesting that we give them the flexibility to move funds from operations to personnel. So those are in the works. Yeah, any updates, I'll provide the members with that. But as of right now, those are the only appropriations bill amendments that I received. I recognize Rep. Babalta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too just had questions about amending the current budget. since now the austerity has been lifted. I think that was something that was part of the current budget numbers. And so now that the executive order was issued and austerity is now lifted, is that something that needs to be amended? As well as the concern that the Division of Parks and Recreations was temporarily moved under the Department of Public Lands and has now moved back to DLNR. And so will that also be reflected in their budget so that they can cover the cost of that move? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Sheila. I think that the reason why, if you look at the budget, there are several employees that were zeroed out, and that's because they're still in the budget. And so when funds come in, then that will make up their hours or any shortfall. In regards to the Parks and Rec, we can look into that, but because they're already budgeted and they're still being paid for through the department, but we'll get further clarification on that.
I have a question.
Recognize Rep. Abata.
When do we anticipate budget hearings to begin? I'm due to be off island and I wanted to make sure I don't miss any if I can.
We'll be holding them when you leave. No,
Just like Rodan for me.
No, so I'm giving our fiscal analyst enough time to review the budget. We're gonna space them out so that way, if we're gonna do Rhoda first or Tinian first or whatever agencies, then he can prepare for that department or that municipality first. And so what's tentative is Rhoda on the end of the month, and then Tinian the first week of May, and then the rest will be done on Saipan throughout May to June. We're looking at we're hoping to get the product done by the end of June, and that'll give the Senate enough time to do their hearings and give us time to review both versions. And so again, members, if we're gonna schedule budget hearings on Rhoda and Tinian, any bills that you have, please prepare them. That way we can kind of schedule it to where you can hold your public hearings on those islands, considering that you'll be there anyway for the budget hearing, so you can have your hearings held while you're there and not have to fly back and forth on different days. Unless, I mean, the Rhoda and Tinian would appreciate it, I know, but to save on costs, we'll try to package it all together. So again, end of April, I'm still working. I'm going to work it out with the Mayor of Rhoda, and then Tinian will be first week of May. I mean, I know they have a fiesta, but that's not why. That's not why it's scheduled in May. It's because Rep. Selena will be leaving mid-May, so we want to get those out of the way, and then we'll work on the agencies on Saipan from mid-May to early June. All right, any other under miscellaneous members?
I have a question, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, thank you.
Recognize.
So in regards to the budget hearings and the agencies that we will be calling in, how is that determined? On what agencies we will be calling in for hearings?
So if you look at the budget, there's it looks like it's very similar to last fiscal year in regards to the austerity measures, but that's because the ARPA will come in and cover any shortfall. What we may end up doing, and this is something that we can decide in another meeting, which are the critical agencies that have just been under budgeted compared to the others, and then we'll meet with them as opposed to every single agency. Again, if you look at volume 4, it does show what the governor's plans are in regards to providing additional funding to those agencies, and so that will cover any shortfall. But but what we can do is hear out these departments and see with the inclusion of the ARPA, will they still have enough to run their operations and fund personnel? Yeah. All right, any other under miscellaneous? All right, I just want to take this time to thank our legal counsel, Joe Tyrone, our LA, sitting in for Ms. Claire Giovanni Taitano, Mr. Dennis Regis, Sergeant Arms, and Mr. Jonathan Diaz. And so with that, members, moving on to the next item in the agenda. Can I get a motion?
Motion.
Oh, and thank you, members of the gallery and the media for being here today. I hear a motion to adjourn from Rep. Leila. Did I get a second?
Yeah.
Seconded by Rep. Sheila Vivalta. All those in favor of the motion say aye. All opposed say nay. Motion carries. This meeting is adjourned at 3:29 p.m.
Yay.